we've covered put, and we've been doing get requests for a while now. And now we're going to create a resource. And the HTTP verb there is going to be post. And we're going to want to return a 201 created response. And we might want to actually return the Pokemon data itself. And then we're going to return a delete response, or excuse me, we're going to, for delete, our HTTP method is delete, and we're going to return 204 no content. And we're going to go ahead and implement that on the back end and then on the front end. So the endpoint that we want to use for creating, we kind of already have here. In URLs py, I've got API/v1/Pokemon, and that's about what we want, right? Because we're creating a brand new Pokemon. So we can just hook into that root path that we have, this base path that we have right here that returns everything. And we could have our all Pokemon API view. We could add to it a post method. Just like we have the get method and we added the other methods here for a Pokemon. And the name would be a little misleading, but it actually makes the implementation very simple, and it's not the end of the world. What you may sometimes also see, and this is a bit of a design choice, is maybe sometimes for creating, there is like an endpoint specifically that says create. It's a little bit of 6 of one and half dozen of the other. So we've got this all Pokemon API view, and we're going to go ahead and add this post method to it. And Django REST Framework is going to do the work of calling that post when we send a post request to create our Pokemon. And to give a quick preview in Thunder Client of what we want to have happen here, we want to hit this endpoint API/v1/Pokemon with a post request. And then in the body, we're going to send a bunch of JSON with things like, the Pokemon name and description and so on. So this is where we're gonna end up. And in fact, I can do this right now and I should get a failure, right? In fact, I say method post, not allowed. And in fact, if I want to, I can go ahead and we can create that post method right now. And we can just have it return an HTTP response that isn't doing anything. And now this is great. This is a great start. We're looking at stuff. We've got the ball rolling. Let me go ahead and add a print statement as an F string. And I'll just, say, I think all Pokemon post response data, and we'll put the contents of the request body in there. And now I should see in my terminal, in my console, that message. And I've got, on the right side here is the front end stuff. On the left side, the Vite dev server. On the left side here is the Django server running. So this is great. I'm correctly grabbing my response data. We're already making pretty good progress here, and this should look a little bit familiar. And just like we did with the put endpoint, we can use the serializer that we already wrote to do most of the work. And as a quick reminder, because I realized I did touch on this, I think briefly right before break, The biggest change I made to our Pokemon serializer is before we had a list of fields, and I replaced it with this special keyword, this magic string, dunderscore or dunder all, and that tells Django REST Framework just use all the fields on the model, right? And that way we get access to all of them when we're using our serializer for the purposes of creating and updating and so on. And that's by far our easiest path forward right now. So at this point, we really just are leveraging our serializer that we previously wrote. And this is why, though object-oriented programming does have extra layers and complexity, it's also really powerful. And we're passing it the data that we need. And unlike the update where we wanted to allow for only passing some required fields to update a Pokemon, if we're creating a Pokemon from scratch, we probably want there to be all required fields. So we don't need to pass partial at all. It defaults to false. And we're going to use the isValid method to run our validation. If new Pokemon is valid, let's go ahead and save it and return a response that has the Pokemon data. And remember that on a serializer, this .data property is what accesses the dictionary that has all the stuff that then gets turned into JSON. And we're going to send back an HTTP status. And it's going to be a 201. So I do want to import that. And let me just go ahead and make this part much wider because we're not really, in fact, I'll just close these out entirely because we're not using them right now. And let's go ahead and import our HTTP 201 request. And the tab completion tells me that I don't have any typos or anything. And that looks good. And we return. Otherwise, if there is an error, then we want to return an error response. So we're going to return an HTTP response with a list of errors. And the serializer class does the work of creating this. It's probably a dictionary for us based on what happens when we run that isValid method, just as we've seen when we've written our own classes in Python. And we're going to return one of the HTTP error response codes. We're going to return 400 bad requests. And we're going to get rid of that sort of placeholder there for returning stuff. And now actually, we should have enough to have this up and running with Thunder Client. And what we should see is that it's going to want us to give all the information we need to properly create a Pokemon. And I'll just do Charmander. And we don't need to pass primary keys or anything like that. And so this will throw an error. And it should return in the response some sort of error message. And it's buried here in HTML. We look at results. It's not test results. It's a little harder to read here this way because they're showing us the raw results. In some ways, it's actually easier to read in the browser. But we see the same error message here in the Django console. Let's see here. Name data is not defined. So that actually looks like a typo in my code. And they say that it's coming from line 25. And indeed, I just added an extra data. So that's the good kind of problem to have. That's an easy fix. And now actually we're getting something much better. And we don't really have a lot of other required fields. So we've just gone ahead and created Charmander. And if I use the Python shell, I'm just going to activate my virtual environment to excuse me. And now import the Pokemon model. And just to maybe Pokemon objects all, we can see that Charmanders actually have 2 Charmanders in there. And actually, if I keep hitting this, I think I'll now have 3 or 4 Charmanders. And so that points out something that would be a good feature to add. We're not going to worry about it right now, but really what we probably want to do is add a uniqueness constraint to the Pokemon name on the model, and that would solve this problem for us. But that's kind of its own thing and a separate task, but we've got this working great. And we're able to create Pokemon, and I could go ahead and add, whatever other fields I wanted in here as well. And we can see all this default stuff gets built out, but if I wanted to add it in here, I absolutely could. I don't know much about Squirtle, what makes them special.
They're a water Pokemon.
That'll do it. And then Eevee was the multiple evolutions one, actually. So we could add Eevee in later. And now we have Squirtle as well. So let me just pause it and see what questions folks have before switching gears to move on to the front end. And yeah, about this or about any kind of part of this backend work that we just implemented.
Yeah, Adam, would you mind going back to your serializer?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to look at that all Dunder method.
Yeah, totally. And this is just a special string value that we set for fields. And then Pokemon serializer knows that it means use all fields on the model. And that is a little bit of magic. What other questions do people have, or what other things are folks curious about? Cool. Let's as long as we're doing the backend stuff, let's go ahead and implement delete, and then let's move on to the front end. And then I'll circle back for writing some tests. So delete is quite straightforward as well. Really, especially because we're deleting a specific Pokemon, right? So our route is going to be, I'll actually put it here. We're going to do delete, and then the ID or the name of our Pokemon. And actually, if I put in Charmander now, it will probably break because I have a bunch of Charmanders in my database. And let me actually delete some of these Charmanders. And I'm just going to do C equals Pokemon objects first, which gives me the first from all of our Pokemons there. And it's a Charmander. I'm going to do C dot delete. And I'm going to run that again. That should be another Charmander. And we're going to delete that one too. And I think we had 3 in there. So let's delete one more Charmander. And now if I do Pokemon objects all, I've just got Charmander and Squirtle, right? And we're seeing what's in the database here. So now if I do this, this won't throw an error. And again, the fix there is we got to update the model so names are unique. So we're going to do delete. And in fact, I probably can just pass in the body, or really in the URL, the ID of the Pokemon that I want to delete. Apologies, which I'm doing right here. I kept expecting to see a number there, right? So we can do delete Pokemon with ID 1 or with name Charmander. And in this case, we're not actually going to pass anything in the request body. And if I run this right now, we should get an error. And it says method delete not allowed because we haven't created it yet. And so that is going to be our next step. And we have a route already set up. This one right here, the same one we use to view an individual Pokemon. And we have this a Pokemon API view. And that's what we're going to add our delete method to. So we've got get, we've got put, and let's add delete. I'm actually going to copy this because there's a lot of duplicate code between some parts of get and delete. And as these classes get bigger in views, if we want to, we can maybe like make a views directory and start putting them in individual files, but it doesn't make a big difference, especially now. We don't have that much code in here. And just like we did here, and just like we did here, we're going to need to add this bit of logic to grab the desired Pokemon. Because ID can be a string or a variable. And I'm going to, again, add a print statement. Just to print out the ID. And again, I'm going to add just an empty HTTP response because I just want to hit my endpoint as a way to make sure I don't have any typos or problems in my code. And Pylint seems to be telling me to use a function called isInstance rather than type, which I'm sure works almost exactly the same, but I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to go ahead and hit this request. And now we should, it's not going to do anything, but I should see a print statement here in my Django server console, and I should just see true returned back. And indeed, I have a typo hiding, and it looks like Pokemon matching query does not exist. And this is not actually a typo. This is probably because I've been creating and deleting Pokemon left and right, and there is no Pokemon in the database with an ID of 1. And I can check this, and this is a good thing to see because there will be things sometimes where the problem is not with your code, but simply that the data wasn't what you expected. We've got 2 Pokemon in here. So if I do Pokemon objects all and grab the first one in the list and do .id, we can see their ID. And if I do that same for the second in the list, we can see that they've got ID 4 and 5. So let's update our request to work with ID 4. That works. Let's also pass a name just to make sure that I didn't have a typo in that branch of my conditional. And that works as well. And if I pop back to Django server, I see my print statements and I see exactly what I want. So now, we're starting to see some duplicate code pop up. This basically get a Pokemon by name or ID. So it might be nice to break this out into a function, right, that we can reuse. And it probably would look something like this. I'm just going to go ahead, in fact, and copy this code. And then I think up here, I'm just going to write it as a method. I'll delete these comments in here in a minute just for clarity. But let's do get Pokemon by name or ID. And the argument it will take will be name or ID. And we're just going to paste that code that we had in there. and I'll fix my indentation. And there's a little bit more to do there. Mainly, I changed the argument name to name or ID. So it's a little more explicit. Doesn't really matter. We could have just left it as ID. And then I need to make this change here as well. And here as well, where we're using title to uppercase the first character of that name. And then what I actually want to do is just return my Pokemon. So I can just do return Pokemon. Or if I want to make things even simpler, I could just put a return statement here and a return statement here. And I'm going to try it out right now in the delete method. Fingers crossed I didn't make any typos or anything, and it'll work great. Otherwise, I'll just kind of keep running with what we have, and we can always circle back to that later. So I'm just commenting out all that other code that I wrote a minute ago. Oh, excuse me. I'm so sorry. This is the wrong method. Let me just go ahead and collapse that get entirely. Let's do this in the delete. Let me comment out that other code that I wrote a moment ago. And we'll do Pokemon equals get Pokemon by name or ID. ID. And if we see our print statement, when we hit this endpoint, we'll know that this worked. And it looks good. Again, we're not actually deleting anything yet. Just to make sure I didn't have a typo or something wrong related to the conditional logic in that get name or ID with a number. Let's test it with a number as well. Same issue as before. I just have to remember my desired Pokemon ID, and there we've got Pokemon ID 4. So I just want to pause and see if folks have any questions about stuff. And I'll leave this stuff commented out and just leave a comment here that this replaces the above conditional logic. And now we could use this in all of our class methods. And it's really easy to write a unit test for this as well, which is great. So now let's actually delete this Pokemon. And give me just a moment to get to where I want to be. Again, this is super straightforward. We can wrap this in a try catch if we want to. That's not necessarily the worst idea, because it's possible that the deletion will go wrong. So let me just get the deletion working, and then maybe we'll wrap it in a try catch block. And so we're just going to do Pokemon delete. Now let me put this right there. And in our response, we're going to return status HTTP 204. What is also common is to return the ID of the thing that we deleted. That depends a bit more just on API design. So this is a good delete method right here. And then, if I want to, what I could do is I could do try, and then I believe is it catch or accept in Python? Can someone remind me? Something, does that look about right for a try except block in Python?
I mean, I think so, but I also get confused sometimes. I kind of just do it. If it works, it works. And if not, I just switch it. I don't even think about it.
I think you might need an as between exception and E.
Yeah, you might. You might be right. I'm in the same boat. I by no means like remember everything off the top of my head. I'm constantly Googling. And it looks like basically we can do like accept and add an exception. We can do exception as different things. And just we could flesh this out to choose the right kind of exception to get a little more detailed information. But really, this is not the best API design because it'd be nice to return a bit more information, but we can at least give an HTTP response code and we'll just say 400 bad request. And maybe we do need to do exception as E. You might be right there, Megan. And now Python seems to be happy with me. Though now I have some other unused variable E. That's fine. And now let's test this out. So first of all, if I pass ID 1, we know this Pokemon doesn't exist. That should trip the accept in my try except block, and I should get a 400 bad request. And instead I got a 500 internal server error. Probably because I must not be handling this exception correctly. So I'm going to come back to that later. I don't quite want to go down that rabbit hole. And in fact, I'm just going to simplify and leave this stuff out, and we can come back to it. Let's try our happy path for deleting the Pokemon with ID 5. And I got a 201 back. And that would be because I have a typo there. I believe we want a 204 no content response because we are not creating anything. So now I've only got one Pokemon left in my database. Charmander. So I don't want to delete Charmander so we can continue to play around with him. We might stick some more data in there because we probably will need to delete people. In fact, I think I will create a new Pokemon. We'll recreate Squirtle. Just so there's someone in there because we're going to be deleting more people soon. Right, and this is where sort of mock data and helper scripts start to become more and more useful. And now if I want to delete a Pokemon with ID 6 or 7, I can. So we've got our delete endpoint working. It does indeed delete stuff. Do folks have any questions or things they'd like me to go over again? Okay, cool. Let's add some front end. And is it useful to see this? Because I know that we saw the more complex version with put. And is it helpful to kind of see these implementations as well?
Yep.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and implement some user interface stuff on the front end. And then we will circle back to testing. So I can close this out because I'm not going to be using the Python code for a hot minute. And we're going to start looking at our front end code. And if we take a look at our user interface, I'll just put this over here so I can see it. And I'm going to clear and do a hard refresh, which is just my habit to make sure that this is all running as we want. Right, we've gone ahead, we've added these update forms to update our Pokemon. We've added a hard refresh so that if I give Squirtle a description and indicate that they're caught, when I hit refresh, let's see. Cannot read properties of undefined, Axios error. I bet the issue here is maybe Squirtle needs a name. Let's see what the Django console says. If it gives us any other information on the error. And it does indeed request body name, field must not be, may not be blank. Which I admit being, I see what's going on. So I'm a little surprised because I do remember when we did our work with the serializer, we said, hey, let's allow partial updates. Right? If we go back to our views PY to put, right, to update a Pokemon right here, we pass this partial argument. So that works great. And we pretty sure we tested that out with Thunder Client. However, what we did not do is in the front end code, if we look at that Pokemon item and this Pokemon form that we wrote in here, I am always sending a name, whether there is a new name value or not. Right, which means that I'm sending an empty string. And in fact, if we look at our network request, 5 gets you 10, that's exactly what we see. I'm gonna update Squirtle again. And if we look in here and we look at the request, really the request body, which is hiding somewhere in here. Oh wait, it's in this one, not the options one. I apologize. They call it payload, request payload. Same thing as request body. And to recap, there's often 2 HTTP requests made. One has this options verb, and that's more of like a handshake. And so this we can ignore, and that's not the request that contains our data that's going to update stuff. And it's this second request that is the put request. And I can see here that the name is indeed an empty string, and that's what's throwing the error. So our backend code is actually perfectly fine, but the front end code is not interacting with the API the way that it should. This is a pretty common issue. There's a number of approaches. A really simple one is to use the OR operator and like a fall through or a fallback or fall through, I think is what this is called. Because in JavaScript, if new name is an empty string, JavaScript evaluates that as falsy, and we can just say Pokemon.name. And now, when I make that HTTP request to make Squirtle a Pokemon of renown, it should work. And because in our React code, remember what we do on a successful response is force the page to reload. So that forces our React app to start over and make that first request to get all the Pokemon. And that's how we get the new updated information about Squirtle. And if I look in here, I do indeed see for the default Squirtle is a Pokemon of renown. And I can see that stuff here and in the console as well. You know, if I do Pokemon objects all, and we look at the second one, and we look at Squirtle's description, he's a Pokemon, or they're a Pokemon of renown. So that's a bit of just a recap kind of for what we have going on here. And now the 2 pieces that we're going to want to add are a delete button, and we're going to want to have some sort of create Pokemon form, right? And we might reuse some of this Or we might just build it out and have this sort of like reuse be a refactor task that we do later. Let's add the delete button, as that's a bit more of a straightforward task, and I think a good starting point. So we've got to do two things here. And I think I'm just going to put the logic right here with this Pokemon form component that I wrote. And I need to make the delete button. 2, when it's clicked, make an Axios request to delete the Pokemon. 3, when Pokemon is deleted, for my Axios success response logic, force a page refresh to see the updated Pokemon list. Right? We need to build the user interface. We need to have it make the API call, and then we need to do something to get the new updated data and have that show in our user interface as well. So out of these 3 things, making the button is by far the easiest part. I am going to go ahead and write just a skeleton of our delete Pokemon function, just to get the ball rolling. And we know it's going to be an async function, and we know it's going to look like this. And in fact, I could copy an awful lot of what I have in here under update Pokemon, because this is almost the same, right? And in fact, if we want to, a good refactoring task would be, maybe there's some logic there that we can consolidate, or maybe not. It's the comments make the code seem like more than it is. The biggest difference here is I don't need to pass this data argument. And instead of put, we're going to do delete. And that should be pretty much the whole thing. I'm going to add a console log here, just delete Pokemon, and we'll pass Pokemon.id. I just want to know that this is being called. I'll add the little parentheses here so that when I look at my console logs, I can see that this is my delete Pokemon function call. And this is pretty much what we want to do, right? We print the error. I've got a console log here for the results. We'll handle the success. I'm going to delete this stuff just to consolidate code. This is actually a pretty compact piece of code right here. And in fact, now I've taken care of this page refresh step because we're using the exact same sort of UI update logic from update Pokemon. So now I should be able to just hook this right in, and fingers crossed, we will be off to the races. So I am going to add the button. The one tricky bit is I don't want to put it inside this form. Because if I do, there's a good chance, because of the way HTML forms work, if I accidentally make a mistake and I don't do like prevent default, then maybe hitting the delete button also, like, the form grabs it and tries to update a Pokemon as well, which would not be what we want. So this is a little bit of a hacky approach, but I'm just going to add a div, and I'm going to wrap this whole form inside of a div. There are definitely better, cleaner ways to do this, but this works perfectly well. And let me go ahead and just update my indenting. And truth be told, this may or may not be hacky. Using the unordered list like we kind of have in the code for the class is good. It would really end up depending more what we did with our CSS than anything else in a lot of ways. And so now I will add this button. And it's going to say on click, delete Pokemon. And we're just going to say delete. And now if I go over to my UI, let's see if first, let me actually check here to make sure there's no errors. And now I've got this delete button. So let's see what happens. I'm going to clear my console here. And I'm going to clear the Django terminal here. And there's two things I'm going to want to check. That the Pokemon has been deleted. And very importantly, that the right Pokemon has been deleted. So we want to delete. Let's do the second one and not the first. Squirtle. Squirtle does seem to be gone now. Looking here, I'm not seeing any problems. And if I do Pokemon objects all, I just have a typo. Then we've only got Charmander. So now our delete is hooked up and running. And I could delete Charmander as well if I wanted. And it sure does look like we deleted the right Pokemon. Right. And if I was doing this for real, I would add a bit more fake data and do a bit more manual testing. And then we'll see writing like unit tests in a minute and stuff. So I just kind of want to pause and see what questions people have or what would be helpful to go over with this flow, whether it's with the React code or how React is interacting with Django or anything else. Are people starting to feel like you're kind of getting the hang of what these patterns look like a bit more? Yes, no, maybe, sort of.
Yeah, I'd say maybe a kind of for me. But I was just wondering, what would the like create method look like for the React code?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're going to do next. And that's where it gets, I think, a little more interesting and where we start to have choices. And actually just before diving into that, is there any bit of sort of this delete logic in UI that would be helpful to go over quickly that folks would like to just maybe do a once over on? Okay, cool, awesome. And I'm glad it's starting to click a bit. So with create, there's two things that we got to think about. The first thing is we're going to have a couple different forms now, right? For updating a Pokemon and creating a Pokemon. And where do we want to put those things? There's a lot of different possibilities. I think the important thing to note is that I'm just going to use the elements tab to sort of, actually, let me use the annotation tool. This is a list of Pokemon, right? Really, it stretches across the whole screen. And in fact, let me go ahead. Let's actually add one or two Pokemon quickly, just so we can see that, because that will actually help a lot with building this UI out. So let me quickly open. I see, and it's because of the annotation tool. Let's try that again. Let me quickly open up Thunder Client, and we're going to make some post requests. And we're going to go to 127.0.0.1, blah, 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 Pokemon. No ID, because we're creating a new one. And we will create, obviously, Pikachu. And EV, which I think is EVEE, correct? And EV will get the description as uniquely able to evolve as you all can tell, I'm not great at not making typos. I've gotten good at catching my typos most of the time when I make them. What's another Pokemon? Let's throw like one or two more Pokemon in there. We've got Charmander, Pikachu, Eevee. We should probably bring Squirtle back, right? And who else do we want to throw into the mix? What's a couple other Pokemon we want to be able to play with here?
Donkey Kong
Is that actually a Pokemon name?
sure is.
I love it. Awesome. And we'll give him a description of for the uninitiated actually Pokemon name. Yeah, Nintendo does kind of get Donkey Kong into like all their intellectual property, don't they? I don't think we'll hit a length limit with description, but we'll find out. Maybe the multiple capitals it did not like for the name format. Interesting. Oh, and in fact, now their name is misspelled, so we'll just have to live with it. And what's maybe one more Pokemon we want to throw into the mix?
Sonic.
And I'm clearly showing my age and Pokemon ignorance here, so I keep worrying I'm being trolled. But I can also imagine from the little I know of Pokemon that is a vast world. So now we have a whole bunch of Pokemon, and the value of doing that is now when I go over here, I can really see the list, right? And if I kind of look at the components tree. And let me get rid of this annotation tool. If I look at the components tree and use React components and kind of poke around in here and just dig down, we finally get to the Pokemon page component. And inside there, we have a bunch of Pokemon items. There we go. We'll make this nice and big. Right. And this, I think, will help too, because I know it was maybe a bit confusing to see that I kind of wrote this Pokemon form component. Our Pokemon page, and we have that map that goes through the list of Pokemon we get, and it renders all the different Pokemon items. And then that, in turn, for each one renders our little Pokemon form, which is also where I stuck the delete button. So, for updating and deleting, it makes sense that these are both on our Pokemon item components because these are for individual Pokemon. When we're creating a new Pokemon, that's not really an individual Pokemon. So I think we want to put this on our Pokemon page component at the top level, right? So that's sort of the first decision to be made is like, where should this go? Because it raises questions of, do we want to try and reuse any of our form fields from update? And the answer is maybe, but not right now. And we should be able to write most of our update logic there pretty independently. So especially as the UIs start to get more complex, a little bit of sort of upfront thinking through this design, I think helps ease the process a lot, because now we have a really clear implementation path. I'm not going to worry about Pokemon item, though actually I will keep it up because this actually will be, I think, pretty good guide code. I am going to go to the pages and to Pokemon, and here's where we're going to add our stuff. Right, and I'm going to follow the same pattern that I did before of one, add the form fields and button without any React state. Two, hook them up to React state. Three, make the create Pokemon function do our Axios post API v1 Pokemon and grab all the React state for our new Pokemon. And put it in the body of our request. It's going to look an awful lot like the logic for the put that we just did, except we're going to be posting instead of putting. And I am going to do a bit of copying and pasting for the forms, for the front end form stuff, just in the interest of time. And I think what I'm going to do here as well is I'm going to make a new component for me that it just helps me organize my world a bit more. You absolutely can do everything I'm about to do here inside the Pokemon component. Does that make sense? And actually, do folks have kind of any questions? And I'll just not even an H1. I'll just put in a div saying hello. And we know that we're going to want a form probably at some point. So I'll put in an extra form. And there's not going to be anything in it. But right now that's it. And let's see what this little squiggly is for. Declared, but its value is never used. And in fact, let's go ahead and use it. And let's go ahead and put it into our Pokemon page. And we're going to put it almost at the top, right below the heading. It's going to look ugly. And that's okay. And that's a separate task. So what I want to do is, if I have this right, close out this row. Create another one. We're going to close that one out too. And borrow this one more time. And oh yeah, and React likes none of this because now these are not wrapped properly. So maybe what I'll do is I could put all these rows inside the rows. I'm not even going to worry about the row stuff right now, to be honest. Let's just put it right here and we can work that out later. I would either wrap this whole thing in a fragment or spend a bit more time properly setting up my bootstrap. But that's not really our focus right now on what the feature we want to build. So let's just go ahead and do the create Pokemon form. And make sure I don't have a typo in that component name to fix. And so I should just really be seeing like a hello right now. And let's see what we see. So way off over here, I see hello. Right, so this user interface is going to be terrible. But we're going to have it working. And once it's working, it becomes way easier to add stuff onto it. Like something I didn't implement that is quite good to implement is to hide or show this update field. And actually, because it's a separate component, we can do that very easily in the Pokemon item with a little Boolean and a ternary and a bit of state that where we flip it from true to false, you know, if the user clicks show update field or not, or clicks the update button. But so we've got our Pokemon form, and let's just start building this out. And as I said, I am going to do some absolutely shameless copying, but intentionally and in the interest of time. And we're going to want an input field, and we're going to want it to be our Pokemon name. And so I do want to, I think, create the state and all the things we'll want, because I do hate writing code that does not actually run. So we know that we're going to have to do certain things. We know we're going to want to do on submit and pass stuff into like create Pokemon function. And this is where naming can be tricky because I want my autocomplete to be my friend. So I'm going to do create new Pokemon as the name of my function. And let's make that now. And it's going to be create new Pokemon. And actually, let's pull up some guide code from Pokemon item. And let's go find update Pokemon. This is going to be really quite similar. And I don't always remember syntax either. Half the time I pull up some guide code that I've already written as a reminder for this stuff. The important thing is doing it intentionally. And we'll add our console log here so we can see what's going on. And we'll just, for the moment, have it be that. And it's just an empty function that does nothing, which is perfectly fine because now this is a real function call. And now we want to start creating Pokemon state for all the things that we need to create, right? And we want to create state for our Pokemon's name. And we want people to be able to add a description. And probably a type and a level, and if it's been captured or not. And there's a little bit of repetition here, but it's not actually that bad. And captured, I will give it a Boolean, not necessarily because the backend needs it, but because I want to indicate to other programmers what type of value this should be. So now I've got a bunch of state that I can use to build out my form fields. And there are ways to kind of write abstractions to help with this. But 5 fields is actually not that many. Once we start getting to like 10, then it can become a bit more. And I'm in fact just going to do a bunch of like 3 or 4 copying and pastes, and we're just going to go ahead and update each of these. And this is also where autocomplete really is your friend, both to avoid typos and help with stuff like this, which is a surprisingly large part of programming. And level is a number. So I will change the input field type. And just for consistency's sake, we'll just, I'm actually going to put null. This is where it gets a little tricky, and where we can't quite have perfect front end and back end coupling because we have a default setting for our Pokemon level. But if in my create JSON, I pass in, level 0 or level is null, then we'll hit a validation error. And since we have a default level set, I don't want to set a different default level here. There are various ways around that. Sometimes constants files are shared across the front end and the back end. But sometimes you also simply have to look at the backend code, and that's part of why writing tests and like documentation of a feature that stretches across the front end and the back end is important, because a Pokemon's default level actually now really does involve the front end and the back end being in sync, right? So we're going to set that Pokemon's default level to none. In fact, we'll set the Pokemon's default type to normal, because we're running into the same issue with all of our default types. So let's actually just use this as a guide. And for our default description, it should really be unknown. There are a lot of ways of dealing with this. This is only one approach. And this one also has the value of expediency. So now we've got our description, we've got our type, we've got our level. Let's actually have the description maybe have a little more room for typing, since it is supposed to be a bit richer in terms of text. So let's make this a text area. And let's see. I think I got everything except captured. And captured is going to be a checkbox like we saw before. Oh, my apologies there. The autocomplete seems to and our on change is going to be pretty much the same. Except we do e-target checked, because the checkbox input type works slightly differently. And now I'm just going to do a sanity check. My user interface is genuinely terrible, but again, especially just in the interests of time and focusing on one thing at a time, I'm not even going to worry about this right now. I'm going to get this feature working, and then we could tackle making this actually look decent, and we absolutely should, as a separate follow-up feature. And for prototyping, that makes a lot of sense. And then the last thing we need is our submit button. And I just want to pause and check in and see what questions folks have about this code. Are people feeling pretty good? And is this starting to ring bells from what we saw this morning? Is a pattern is starting to emerge, I hope. And just like this morning, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a very like manual test process here of in my create Pokemon form. What is this component is not running in strict mode, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to ignore that for now. Let me actually do a page refresh to make sure there aren't any issues. And I'm just going to update stuff. I want to make sure I didn't get one of those, set description, set type hooks wrong. And my description field is actually updating the Pokemon type. Though it is a little unfortunate that I'm not seeing. There we go. I don't know why they hide it, but now we can see the name of each bit of state. So now I can actually use this to properly test that I've hooked up everything correctly. And taking the short amount of time to do this now will save me a lot of pain if I do have something wrong. And the checkbox can be a little tricky. So things are looking good, and we're almost ready to fire off a request and create a Pokemon. I am just going to do a little clearing of my Django console so we can get some good data if we do have an error when we run this. And let's put this off to the side. Let's go up here. And now we have to add the logic for creating the Pokemon. And again, the good news here is we're going to be able to borrow an awful lot of this from our update Pokemon function. Because what do we want to do? Well, we've added the form fields. We've hooked them up to React State. And now we want to do this step. And we can even break this part into steps. And we should. Right? Step one is construct the data object with new Pokemon data. Step two is make the post request. Step three is add catch for errors. And step four is on success, refresh page so we get updated list of Pokemon with our new Pokemon. And let me actually ask and check in. This is actually the most important part. I know it doesn't feel that way. So I'm curious if folks have any questions around this, and if this makes sense, just kind of talking through what we want to do at this level for implementing. Cool. And hopefully seeing this is helpful, because this is actually when you are working on a problem and you feel like I'm not sure what to do. This is actually step one, is breaking it down in plain language like this, because I can guarantee that every time, step one, step two, you'll probably be like, yeah, I do know how to do that. And then you can make some forward progress and get some code that you can run and test with some print statements or something. And then when you get to step three, you may either need to, reach out to a TA or Francisco or myself for help, or do some research or look at some guide code. But now all of a sudden we've turned like a big ball of unknowns and complexity into something that actually has like bounds and scope and is manageable, and that we can move forward on and figure out. And this is also, by the way, the same process you really use for technical interviews and programming problems. Right? It's all about taking big unknowns and breaking them into little things that we can know more easily. And I am consulting my guide code, because there is one important piece I did miss here, which is, since this is a form submit, which means this event gets passed, we need to call prevent default. And I actually think this is such an easy mistake to make, to forget this, like I just did now. And so the way that when I make mistakes like that, like I figure out patterns that I can do to avoid that mistake. And while this handle submit form function is an extra step, what it also is a really consistent pattern that's easy to remember, that I can do right when I create a form before I do any other work. That if I'm using the form, we're going to write a handle submit form, and the first thing we're going to do is prevent default. And so if I kind of spent like 30 minutes debugging and that was my error, that would be my sort of mini self-retro on what to do differently next time. But now that we've done that, we can construct our data object that's going to contain all the information we want about our Pokemon. And I can just do name and level and description and captured and type. And this is the same, remember, as name, which is also the same as name. These are all the same in JavaScript. And Axios should do the work for us of turning it all into JSON. And again, I'm just going to kind of look at my guide code from the put request, which is really, really similar. There's certain things I don't need to worry about here. This is why put is more complicated right here, the difference between line 37 and line 29, where I need to deal with the old versus the new version of the name. When we're creating something from brand new from scratch, the logic is much easier. Now we need to make our Axios call. I actually will borrow and copy this code. But I'm going to do it just a little bit at a time because there's always stuff to change and I don't want to miss anything. First off, instead of a put, we need to do a post request to the same endpoint, HTTP 127.0.0.1.8,000. And there is no Pokemon ID because this is a brand new Pokemon that does not exist. And we do want to handle our error. We do want to print a console log with response data. Actually, I should put this console log a bit higher up just so it's right at the beginning of this function call so that I get good console log information if I need to debug. And I'm just going to follow this same pattern for dealing with our success path, which is refresh page to get new Poke data from DB. So if things are successful, and I believe we would get, I actually am going to check our backend code because I don't remember off the top of my head what our response code we're sending back is for creating a new Pokemon. So let's look in our views file for the Pokemon app. And instead of guessing, I'm just going to look. And we're sending back indeed a 201 created. So if response status equals 201, and response status and response code mean the same thing, and you'll hear them used interchangeably. Then we're going to do the page refresh. So fingers crossed, we should be ready to create a Pokemon. And before we actually hit that button and see if there's any bugs in the code that we've written and see if it works, do folks have any questions? So I built out a bunch of stuff here. But again, I'm just sort of following this guide. All right, let's see our moment of truth. What's another Pokemon that we don't have in our database yet, just so we can avoid multiple
Yoshi.
Pokemon? Sorry?
Yoshi.
Then Yoshi's pretty great. So Yoshi's going to be level 100 and Yoshi's going to be captured. And this is a good test too, to fiddle with this stuff a bit. Actually, let's do level 50 because we want to make sure that we're not getting the defaults. Let's actually change all of them so that we can make sure we shouldn't see any defaults for Yoshi. That's a good thing to think about when testing, when like writing these features. Both informally testing like this and writing unit or end-to-end tests And let's see how we do. So I just hit create. Step one is Yoshi in the list? And Yoshi does not seem to be in the list.
Your type wouldn't match the validator.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much, Megan. Yep. And this points out it is, you will, as you are working on your personal projects, sending back good error messages will make your own lives so much easier. We haven't implemented that here, but it'd be very easy to send that error message detail back in the HTTP response. So let's go ahead, and in fact, we can go over here and exactly like you were saying, Megan. We've got a post. I think we've just got bad request. We may not have actually printed in this create Pokemon. We do return a response with the errors. I'm not quite sure why we didn't see our validation error pop up there, but that's a question for another day. Let's try this again. Yoshi is clearly not a rock type Pokemon, but that just means we can test the update function. So let me clear out my data. So when I run this, we can only be looking at the important information. And now Yoshi is indeed a rock, right? And in fact, our noun project API is working pretty great there. And we get to see a rock while everyone is typed normal, which is pretty cool, I have to say. And if we go over here, we see all these GET requests from the page refresh. But if we scroll up a bit in the history of the Django terminal up here, we see the post request that kicked everything off. We see our own print statement. And just to double check, we can go to Pokemon objects all. Yoshi is at the very end there. I think there's maybe 5 of them. So let's see. Here's Yoshi. Let's do a quick manual test to make sure that no default fields are here, that everything got created the way it should be. So we've got Yoshi's name, we've got Yoshi's type, and that one we saw from the icon. We've got Yoshi's description, we've got Yoshi's level, and we've got Yoshi's captured. So everything did work correctly, which is great because it is easy to have one piece of this go wrong, though that's where the serializer helps a lot. So we've just implemented creating a Pokemon, and it's not pretty. Excuse me, it's not pretty, but we've got a Pokemon CRUD application with rocks, and if we make Squirtle a ghost Pokemon type, cannot read properties of undefined because I'm not sure where that one's coming from. This is where stuff I think can get a little tricky. I don't know if we need to put in Squirtle's name here or what exactly was causing that. Let's see if it works. Yeah, this is where the update logic can get a little tricky. If we track this down, it's definitely going to be, we're trying to do some Squirtle creation and some field is missing a length. And in fact, it looks like here, it's Squirtle's description, right? So we're running into another default issue here, where by default, the description is empty. But now when we hit update, we're running into our own validation logic that's setting this 7-character rule. And little things like this are really common with building user interfaces. And that's honestly just part of the workflow, is you run into a case and you kind of figure out what you want to do. And the problem here is also, I was trying to change Squirtle's type when this is actually his description. That's the real problem. And we haven't implemented, in fact, I didn't implement the type. So we can't directly change Squirtle here, but we can delete Squirtle. And let's recreate Squirtle in a new form as Pokemon that went and came back, and their type will be Ghost, in the hopes that we get a great icon from the Noun API and Squirtle will be captured too. And that is maybe the best Noun API icon I've seen yet. And now we've got a full CRUD functionality for our Pokemon app. I would love to get into writing code for unit tests, which is pretty straightforward, but we have been going for a bit over an hour, and I know that people probably want to take a break and also write code themselves. So I think this is probably a good stopping point. So I just kind of want to see what's on people's minds and what questions people have and what bits of this it would be useful to go over.
So for the post method, when you were creating your data structure in React, and you had like name and stuff, and you didn't have you didn't have to declare name or anything like that. It already knows what name and level it is. Was it already declared somewhere else in the?
So what it is, you know, it ends up being very common to do stuff like this and to scroll up a bit so we have the full context, and I'll delete this so it's easier to see. These are the variable names, right? From the state, name, level, type, description, captured.
Yeah. Never mind. I see.
Yeah, I know there was a lot of code being written, so I figured it'd be helpful just to see that bit. And I didn't used to do this, but a former manager of mine was obsessive about having everything be in alphabetical order if there wasn't some other like clearly better way to do it, basically to avoid arguments about what order things should be in, and it actually makes life a lot easier. And then in fact, captured needs to be first. So yeah, like we would just be doing this, and JavaScript introduced basically like the term is syntactic sugar. Under the hood, this is exactly what JavaScript is doing. But if you are, you know, creating a property on an object and the name of the variable you're using is the same name as the property name that you want to create, JavaScript has given us some syntactic sugar to do that. Yeah, that's a great question. What else is on people's minds, and what else do folks have questions about? Cool. And was it helpful to see the front end implementation of this form for creation? Awesome. Okay, glad to hear. And honestly, the feedback is very useful because sometimes it's not always easy for me to assess which parts it's useful to kind of see and see sort of multiple views of the same thing and which ones aren't. So I'm glad that this was really helpful. And yeah, if there is anything on people's minds, I'm happy to stick around a bit to do it. Otherwise, now's a great time to take a break and dive back into writing code, and then we can do a bit of demoing at Stand Down at 5. So thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it. Let me go ahead and stop recording.